Why would a man who has everything, money, status, influence, choose to mock a child in public? Have you ever witnessed arrogance so strong it silenced an entire room? Tonight, in the middle of a glittering New York City restaurant, those questions became painfully real. The chandeliers sparkled above white tablecloths and polished silverware. Laughter and conversation filled the air until a single sound cut through it all, the quiet sobs of a young boy. At a corner table, a child no older than 9 sat with his head lowered, his small shoulders trembling as tears slid down his face. He wasn't disruptive. He wasn't causing a scene. He was just crying softly, the way children sometimes do when their little hearts can no longer hold the weight of the world. But instead of kindness, instead of even the smallest gesture of patience, one man chose cruelty. His name was Richard, a millionaire who carried himself as though the city belonged to him. Expensive suit, gold watch glinting under. The lights, a presence that usually commanded respect. But on this night his power showed its darkest side. "Pathetic," Richard sneered, his voice carrying across the tables. Conversations paused. Forks froze mid-air. He tilted back in his chair, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Who brings a crying boy to a place like this? This is no place for weakness." The words sliced through the restaurant, and all eyes turned toward the child. Some diners looked uncomfortable. Some pretended not to notice, but no one spoke. No one challenged the man who seemed untouchable. And maybe you've seen something like this before. Maybe you've sat in a room where someone in power humiliated another while the rest of the world stayed silent. Have you ever been through this, where the injustice felt so heavy, yet nobody dared to rise against it? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. The boy's tears grew heavier, his little hands clutching at the edge of the table. He wasn't just crying from sadness anymore. His face carried something deeper, shame, confusion, perhaps even the crushing weight of being treated as though he didn't belong. Richard leaned forward again, chuckling under his breath, feeding off the silence around him. The restaurant, once warm and inviting, now felt like a stage for cruelty. And still, not a single guest stood up. It was in that silence that tension began to build, the kind of silence that makes your chest tighten. The kind of silence where you wonder, will anyone say something? Will anyone defend the child? Or will this moment pass, buried under fear and indifference? New York is a city that often hides its heart behind noise and speed. But in that restaurant, in that exact moment, something unexpected was about to break the pattern. What Richard didn't know was that the boy's tears weren't random. They weren't weakness. They were the spark of a truth he could never have imagined. The staff behind the swinging kitchen doors could hear everything, every mocking word, every cruel laugh, and someone inside wasn't willing to let it continue. Someone who knew exactly who the boy was, someone whose authority didn't come from money, but from years of hard work, sweat, and unshakable dignity. And when those kitchen doors finally opened, the room would no longer belong to the millionaire who thought he ruled it. It would belong to the man who dared to speak the truth. Stay close, because what happens next will change everything. Maybe as you listen to this, a memory surfaces of a moment when you saw someone treated unfairly, or maybe when you yourself felt invisible in a room full of people. Stories like this aren't just about millionaires and children. They reflect the way power and vulnerability collide in everyday life. And I'd love to hear from you. What would you have done if you were sitting in that restaurant hearing those words? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your voice adds depth to this story, and together we create a space where silence is no longer the answer. If the emotions here touched you even a little, a simple like on this video tells me this message mattered to you. It also helps more people stumble across stories like this, people who might need to be reminded that compassion is stronger than arrogance. And if you're someone who feels these themes resonate with your own heart, subscribing is the best way to stay close to this community we're building. Every new voice that joins us makes it possible to bring more of these stories to life. Stories that challenge, inspire, and sometimes even heal. Because this isn't just about watching, it's about belonging. When you leave a comment, when you press that like button, when you choose to subscribe, you're helping to keep alive a space where we remind each other of the values that truly matter. And while the story in that restaurant is only beginning, your participation here is what allows it to continue. The silence in that room is about to be broken, and you'll want to be here when it happens. Richard had always been the kind of man who walked into a room and expected it to adjust around him. In the polished glass towers of Manhattan, people whispered his name with a mix of admiration and fear. He was the type of millionaire who thrived on appearances, tailored suits pressed to perfection, shoes that gleamed like mirrors, and a watch that could pay for a year of rent in most of the city. To him, these weren't luxuries. They were signals, reminders to the world that he was above the ordinary, untouchable in his authority. The restaurant that evening was one of his favorites, not because of the food, though the chef's reputation was flawless, but because of what the place represented. It was a theater of wealth where his presence could dominate the stage. He loved the way waiters leaned in with an extra bow of respect when they served his table. He loved the way other diners would glance his way, recognizing him, some even whispering his name under their breath. Richard basked in it, convinced that power was measured in how many eyes turned to follow your every move. His laugh was not subtle, nor was it meant to be. It echoed, bouncing off marble walls designed to be noticed. The man didn't speak quietly. He projected, as though every sentence deserved an audience. That night, his voice was sharp, riding over the clink of glasses and the hum of background music. "Unbelievable," he muttered, loud enough for half the room to hear. "In a place like this, and they bring a child who can't even keep himself together." His words weren't just an observation. They were daggers, thrown with precision, calculated to sting. Richard had lived his whole life believing that money validated cruelty. He told himself it wasn't arrogance, it was simply honesty. If someone couldn't handle being in the same space as him, then they didn't belong there. It was a mindset he carried into boardrooms, into negotiations, and now into a restaurant where a child's tears threatened to break the illusion of his perfect evening. From the outside, Richard seemed unstoppable. He had built empires in real estate, invested in startups that made headlines, appeared on magazine covers where the words visionary and powerhouse were printed beneath his photo. But behind the facade, there was something fragile, something he worked tirelessly to hide. For men like him, arrogance wasn't just ego, it was armor. Without it, the world might see the cracks, the insecurities buried beneath decades of pretending. "Doesn't anyone teach children respect anymore?" Richard continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "This city is falling apart if even restaurants like this can't keep order." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, daring anyone to disagree. But no one did. No one ever did. The power of money wasn't only in what it could buy, but in the silence it demanded, from those who feared losing their own comfort. And yet, the silence in the room was different this time. The diners weren't silent out of respect. They were silent out of discomfort, their eyes shifting toward the boy whose quiet sobs refused to be drowned out. Richard thought the silence meant approval, but what it really revealed was the hidden truth of human hesitation. People knew he was wrong, but they also knew the cost of speaking against him. This was Richard's world, a stage where he believed he was both director and star. The boy at the table was merely a distraction, a background detail to be dismissed. What Richard failed to realize was that the very thing he dismissed was about to dismantle the world he thought was unshakable. As he poured himself another glass of wine, his fingers tapping impatiently against the crystal, he barely noticed the waiter who shifted uncomfortably nearby. He didn't see the nervous glance toward the kitchen doors. He didn't care that his words carried farther than he intended, slipping past the polished dining room and into the heart of the place where true work was being done. Because while Richard lived for the applause of appearances, There was a different kind of power building quietly behind those swinging doors, not the kind that flaunted itself in magazine articles or expensive suits, but the kind that came from resilience, sweat, and unspoken dignity. "Do you think I came here to listen to a child cry?" Richard said suddenly, his tone rising, his words sharp enough to draw the last fragments of attention from the room. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, fixing his gaze on the boy who refused to meet his eyes. "Look at me," he snapped, as though the child owed him obedience simply because he existed. But the boy didn't look up. His tears fell quietly, his shoulders tense, his small hands clenched in his lap. And in that stillness, something unexpected began to stir, a different kind of presence, one Richard couldn't control. This is where arrogance blinds itself. Richard believed authority came from volume, from the intimidation of wealth, from the decisions made in corner offices and penthouses with sweeping views. But the truth he couldn't see was that authority can emerge from the most unlikely places, from the people who rarely raise their voices but hold a kind of strength he had never understood. As he sat there, basking in the illusion of control, Richard was oblivious to the subtle shift in the room. The diners weren't laughing with him. They weren't nodding in approval. They were waiting, watching, sensing the tension about to unfold. And every story like this has a moment, a crack in the surface, where arrogance collides with reality. And the impact leaves more than just embarrassment. It leaves transformation. Richard thought this was just another evening where he could bend the world to his ego. But the restaurant, with all its elegance and shadows, was about to become the stage for something he had never rehearsed for, something no amount of wealth could rewrite, because in that moment, with every breath of silence pressing down on the room, the story was no longer about the millionaire who thought he ruled it. It was about the hidden truth waiting to be revealed, the one that would shatter the performance he had spent his life perfecting. And as the boy wiped his face with trembling hands, refusing to break in the face of humiliation, Richard's world, so carefully built on pride, was already beginning to tremble. Ethan sat small in his chair, his knees barely reaching the edge of the velvet seat cushion. The table was too high for him, the glass of water untouched before him, the linen napkin folded neatly as though he had been too nervous to disturb it. His eyes shimmered in the dim glow of the restaurant's golden chandeliers, and his lips pressed tightly together as though he was trying, really trying, to stop the tears. But no child can carry the weight of humiliation in silence for long. And a quiet sob slipped through, shattering the polished air of the dining room. It wasn't the cry of a tantrum. It wasn't the loud wailing of a child demanding attention. It was the kind of cry that comes from somewhere deeper, somewhere far more fragile, the kind of cry that pulls at you before you even realize it, because it carries with it the sound of heartbreak. His small shoulders trembled, his hands curled into fists in his lap as he fought to control himself. Yet the more he tried, the more visible his struggle became. Richard noticed, and for him, it wasn't a moment of compassion, it was an opportunity. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass, his lips curling into the kind of smile that doesn't come from joy, but from dominance. "Well, look at this," he said loudly, his voice carrying through the room with ease. "What kind of boy cries in a place like this? Weak, out of place." The words landed like stones thrown across the tables, and though no one dared to respond, a ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. A woman at a nearby table shifted in her chair, her eyes softening toward the boy, but she quickly looked away, unwilling to draw Richard's attention. A man cleared his throat, glancing at the boy with pity, but he too lowered his gaze. Ethan's tears only grew heavier. His chest rose and fell quickly, as though each breath was a battle. He whispered under his breath, a fragile attempt to hold himself together. I didn't mean to." His voice cracked, almost too quiet to be heard. Richard's smirk deepened. "Didn't mean to?" he mocked, leaning forward, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "What are you even doing here, boy? You think this is a playground? This is a place for people who belong, and you clearly don't." The cruelty of those words cut deeper than the silence of the onlookers, because silence, at least, leaves room for doubt. But Richard's words sealed the message. To him, Ethan was invisible, unworthy, nothing more than a disruption in the theatre of his evening. And yet, as those tears continued to fall, there was something unspoken in the room. A truth most people ignored but could not deny. Children cry because they feel, because their hearts are still pure enough to react without calculation. Ethan wasn't crying to disrupt the restaurant. He wasn't crying to test anyone's patience. He was crying because he carried a pain too heavy for his small frame to bear in. Silence. And that vulnerability, if you allowed yourself to see it, was the very opposite of weakness. The restaurant's atmosphere, once filled with laughter and polite conversation, now hung heavy. The waiters moved slower, careful not to draw attention to themselves. The music playing faintly in the background seemed distant, almost irrelevant against the weight of Richard's voice. For Ethan, the world had shrunk to that single table, to that single humiliation. And yet, even in his quiet sobs, there was resilience, a silent plea for dignity, for someone to recognize his pain instead of exploiting it. Children like Ethan remind us of something we often forget. Tears are not always signs of fragility. Sometimes they are the body's way of revealing truths words cannot yet carry. Ethan's tears told a story of exhaustion, of fear, of being pushed into a space where he felt unseen. And still, Richard couldn't see it. He was blinded by his own need to dominate, his own craving to be the loudest voice in the room. "Pathetic," Richard muttered again, shaking his head as if to invite others into his judgment. He wanted nods of agreement. He wanted the crowd to share in his arrogance, to validate his performance. But the diners remained still, caught between fear and empathy, unwilling to give him the applause he craved. Ethan wiped at his face with the back of his sleeve, a child's instinctive attempt to erase the evidence of his sadness. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes red, but he lifted his chin just enough to whisper again, almost to himself, "I'm not weak." The words barely escaped his lips, trembling yet determined, and though Richard laughed at them, there was something powerful in that tiny declaration. It's in moments like this where the contrast becomes sharpest. On one side, a millionaire drowning in his own ego, mistaking arrogance for strength. On the other, a boy, trembling and tear-streaked, yet still clinging to a thread of courage that no amount of money could buy. That's where transformation begins, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet resilience of a child refusing to let cruelty define him. And while Richard believed the night was his to control, the truth was slipping from his grasp. Each tear that fell from Ethan's eyes was carving its own impact into the room. The guests who avoided his gaze were not indifferent. They were complicit, struggling with the decision of whether to remain silent or intervene. The hidden truth was that the authority Richard thought he held was fragile, a facade ready to crack under the weight of empathy. The boy's tears were not weakness. They were revelation. They were a behind-the-scenes glimpse into the heart of a child whose story was far bigger than the man who mocked him. And though Richard did not yet realize it, those tears would soon expose him for what he truly was, a man whose power was nothing more than performance. As Ethan sat there, his small body trembling with the effort of holding himself together, the tension in the restaurant deepened. Richard leaned back once more, satisfied with his display, but beneath the surface, a shift was happening. The diners who had stayed silent were beginning to question their own stillness. The staff behind the kitchen doors, who had heard every cruel word, were no longer willing to pretend nothing had happened. And in that fragile moment, when a child's quiet sobs clashed against a man's thunderous arrogance, the balance of power was already beginning to turn. The stage was set, not for Richard's triumph, but for a revelation that would break through the silence and forever change the meaning of that night. The silence in the restaurant became its own kind of weight, pressing against every table and every breath. Crystal glasses trembled faintly in nervous hands. Forks clinked awkwardly against plates as people tried to mask their discomfort with half-hearted bites of food they could no longer taste. Conversations that had once flowed so easily turned into fragments, sentences cut short, laughter strangled in throats. It was as though the very air in the room had shifted, thickened by the presence of cruelty that no one dared to challenge. Richard thrived in that silence. To him, it was confirmation, proof that his words carried authority, that his judgment was final. He mistook fear for respect, the crowd's hesitation for admiration. With a satisfied smirk, he leaned back in his chair and let his voice echo. Again, louder than necessary. "This is what happens when standards slip," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You let one person bring weakness into the room, and suddenly the whole place feels cheap." A man sitting 2 tables away, dressed in a grey suit, shifted uneasily. He lowered his eyes, his hand tightening around the stem of his wineglass. His lips parted, as if he might speak, but then he stopped, swallowing his words before they escaped. His wife placed her hand on his, a silent plea. Not to get involved. Their eyes met, and though nothing was said, the decision was clear. Silence felt safer. Across the room, a young woman in her 20s sat alone, her fork abandoned on her plate. Her gaze lingered on Ethan, her brow furrowed with empathy, but she too glanced away when Richard's eyes swept over the dining room. She whispered to herself, almost inaudible, "Poor kid," before lowering her gaze to her untouched meal. It was human nature at its most conflicted. The crowd wasn't. Made up of villains. They weren't heartless. They felt the injustice like a thorn in their side. But the mindset that guided them was simple. Don't draw attention. Don't disrupt. Don't challenge someone with more power. Decisions were made in an instant. Decisions not to speak, not to risk the impact of being singled out. And in those behind-the-scenes moments of hesitation, Richard grew bolder. Ethan sat quietly, tears running down his flushed cheeks, his small body hunched, as if trying to make himself invisible. The boy didn't understand why no one was saying anything. He could feel eyes on him, could sense the pity in the room, but pity without action only deepened the wound. "Why won't anyone help me?" he whispered to himself, barely audible, his voice cracking with a mixture of confusion and sorrow. Richard heard nothing but his own performance. He lifted his glass again, savoring the taste of his wine like a conqueror celebrating victory. "People need to learn their place," he continued, his tone theatrical. "And children like that, they remind us what happens when discipline disappears." Every word he spoke added to the tension that rippled through the room. Diners fidgeted in their seats, some looking toward the staff as if expecting them to intervene. But the waiters, though visibly uncomfortable, kept moving silently from table to table, their eyes carefully averted from Richard's gaze. They were caught in their own struggle, torn between the duty to serve and the quiet dread of risking their jobs by confronting someone as powerful as him. The suspense grew not from action, but from the lack of it. That suffocating stillness revealed more than any words could. The hidden truth that injustice often survives not because it is strong, but because good people decide to step back instead of stepping forward. The weight of their silence carried its own impact, a quiet revelation about human behavior in the presence of power. A diner near the back coughed, loudly perhaps as a way to break the tension, but no one followed. Another woman dabbed at her lips with her napkin, her hands shaking slightly. A man whispered something to his companion, their eyes darting nervously toward Richard's table. Yet none of them stood, none of them spoke. Ethan's sobs quieted, not because the pain had lessened, but because he was retreating inward, pulling into himself the way children often do when the world feels too big, too cruel. His small voice trembled. "Again, I just wanted to be here," he murmured, his words lost in the shuffle of silverware and whispers. And still, Richard basked in the illusion of dominance. He looked around, convinced that his presence had stilled the room into obedience. He misread their discomfort as validation, their silence as agreement. In his mind, he was the unchallenged center of gravity, the voice that set the rules for everyone else. But silence can only hold for so long. Beneath the polished surface of the dining room, emotions were simmering. Frustration, guilt, compassion, the kind of feelings that eventually demand release. The longer the crowd sat in its paralysis, the heavier the suspense grew, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something, someone, to break the spell. It's in moments like this where transformation is born, where the journey of truth begins its slow climb from the margins to the center. The crowd didn't know it yet, but their hesitation was only a pause. Before revelation, every uncomfortable glance, every whispered word, every averted eye was building toward a decision they would no longer be able to avoid. And just as Richard leaned forward again, his voice ready to slice through the air with another cruel remark, something stirred beyond his awareness. Behind the gleaming double doors of the kitchen, footsteps moved quickly, a presence that carried not just authority, but conviction. The silence that Richard mistook for victory was about to fracture, and when it did, the impact would reach far beyond a single night in a single restaurant. It would reveal a hidden truth he had never prepared himself to face. The kitchen doors didn't just open. They burst outward like a breath the whole room had been holding, finally exhaled. Every head turned. In the frame stood Michael, the chef, coat crisp, arms steady, expression carved with a kind of contained fury that wasn't theatrical like Richard's, but rooted in something deeper. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority has a texture when it's earned, and it carries without shouting. The staff behind him froze mid-step, as if afraid that even their movements might disturb the current of what was about to change. Michael took 3 calm steps onto the dining floor, and with each one, the balance of the room shifted away from the man who had mocked a child, and toward the man who had fed strangers night after night, with relentless care. "Sir," he said, not looking at Richard yet, eyes landing first on the boy. Ethan's shoulders trembled, his hands still clenched in his lap, his gaze fixed on the water glass he had not touched. "Are you all right?" The words were simple, but they were a hand reached across a chasm. Ethan swallowed and nodded, a small, shaky motion that tried to be braver than it felt. I'm okay." His voice was small, the syllables soft, but the room caught them like an apology it should have made long ago. Richard pressed his napkin onto the table with a deliberate flick, the performance returning to his posture. "Finally," he announced to no one in particular, "someone to handle the situation." Then, to Michael, as if delivering instructions to a subordinate, "Get the boy out. This is a place for adults who know how to behave. I spend a lot of money here. Standards matter." Michael's jaw tightened. The line of his mouth didn't quiver. It anchored. He didn't look at Richard when he answered. "Standards do matter." He turned, kneeling slightly so his eyes were level with Ethan's. "Breathe in for 4, out for 4. Ethan followed the rhythm, small chest rising and falling in an honest attempt to comply. "Is someone here with you?" Michael asked gently. Ethan's gaze slid toward the kitchen doors and back, as if the truth were in motion, and he hadn't yet learned how to hold it still. "I'm not alone," he said. The words held layers, like a secret that was almost ready to step into the light. Richard laughed, the kind of laugh that tries to fill a room with confidence and instead bleeds insecurity. "This is absurd. You're a chef. Your job is in the back. Don't bring your behind-the-scenes drama out here." He gestured at the white tablecloths and the art on the walls, as though fine decor could rewrite human dignity. "I come here because this place understands excellence. I expect you to do the same." Michael finally lifted his eyes to Richard, and the room felt a subtle shift, like a tide pulling away from the shore before an impact. "Excellence," Michael said, voice even, "begins with how we treat the smallest and the least protected. That's not a kitchen rule. That's a life rule." The diners who had been trying to fade into their chairs looked up, the spell of silence loosening. Something in the chef's tone invited them to reconsider their own mindset, to rethink the decisions they had made in the last 5 minutes. There are moments when a single sentence becomes a mirror, and people see not just what happened, but who they were while it happened. A waiter near the bar gripped his order pad as if it were a lifeline. "Chef," he whispered, uncertain whether to move, whether to keep pouring wine, whether to pretend the evening could return to normal. Michael gave him a brief nod that said both keep going and watch closely. Leadership is sometimes nothing more and nothing less than the promise that someone is willing to be first. "I'm a paying customer," Richard said, leaning forward, turning the phrase into armor. "I have invested in this city more than most people in this room will in their lifetimes. I know the game, chef. Power keeps this town running. If you let standards slip, everything you built falls apart." Michael's answer didn't arrive like a counterpunch. It arrived like a door opening to a larger room. "Maybe the real standard we've let slip," he said, "is confusing power with character." He was still speaking to Ethan, but each word brushed across the tables, gently rearranging the furniture of people's assumptions. Real excellence requires restraint. It requires knowing when your voice adds value and when your silence would show more strength than your ego. Ethan wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. Calmer now, tears still bright but not spilling. "I didn't mean to ruin anything," he murmured. The apology was instinctive, the kind children learn too early when adults make their feelings into inconveniences. "You didn't ruin anything," Michael said, steady as a metronome. "You revealed something." The phrase trembled in the air, a small revelation, a hidden truth edging into focus. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Revealed what? That people are too soft? That children can't control themselves?" He smirked at the guests as if asking them to endorse the verdict. "You all know I'm right. You just won't say it." No one answered, but the silence had changed shape. It wasn't fear bending to his voice anymore. It was attention turning toward the chef. The journey of the room had pivoted. People weren't waiting for Richard's next line. They were watching Michael to understand what it meant to act with something other than bravado. The impact of that shift couldn't be measured in applause, only in posture. The way shoulders lifted, the way eyes steadied, the way the staff began to step closer to the edge of the dining floor. "Ready." Michael rose from his crouch, standing at his full height, not imposing, just unflinching. "There's a time to stay in the kitchen," he said, "and a time to step out." He looked toward the double doors, and for a second his expression softened, like a father checking the horizon. "Tonight required a decision." He turned back to Richard. "And I made mine." "I made mine too," Richard shot back. "I won't dine in a place that caters to disruptions." The word hung there, stripped of its power, because everyone could see who had disrupted the night and who had tried to repair it. Michael didn't move closer, but somehow he was closer. "You assume your money is the anchor," he said, "but some rooms are held together by the people who do their work quietly, who carry more than they're paid to carry, who absorb the blow so the guests can have their perfect evening." He paused. "Behind the scenes doesn't mean without value. It means we hold the line even when no one claps." A woman at the far table exhaled audibly, as if she had been given permission to breathe. A man in the grey suit glanced at his wife. She didn't stop him this time. They didn't speak yet, but their faces were turning towards something that looked a lot like courage. Suspense isn't just about waiting for the next event. It's about watching the internal transformation of people who didn't think they were part of the story discover they are. Ethan's voice, small but clearer, threaded through the quiet. "I'm not out of place." He said it like he needed to hear the sentence outside his own head. "I belong here." The statement wasn't about the restaurant anymore. It was about the world, about his own sense of worth within it. Michael nodded once, as if sealing an oath. "Yes," he said. "You do." Richard scoffed. "Who is he to you, anyway? Why involve yourself? Take him back to his parents and keep the performance in the kitchen." He lifted his glass again and didn't realize how the motion looked. Rehearsed, defensive, a reflex rather than a decision. For the first time, Michael's gaze sharpened, not heated, but focused like a lens finding its subject. "You're asking why I stepped in," he said, voice level. "You want the short answer or the true one?" He let the question breathe. Richard waved a hand. "Spare me the sermon." But the diners leaned in, drawn by curiosity, sensing the edge of revelations that would reorder the room. Michael didn't offer theatrics. He offered fact, shaped by feeling. "Because the measure of any room," he said, "is how it treats the person with the least protection." He turned slightly, not to the guests, not to the billionaire, but to the space itself, as if addressing the idea of the room. "Tonight, that measure failed, and I was here, so I stepped out." It was the kind of explanation that requires a mindset built on service rather than spectacle, the kind that turns decisions into a quiet credo. "I built half the skyline you people take pictures of," Richard snapped, trying to yank the spotlight back. "Do you know what that takes? Discipline. Hard choices. I don't apologize for wanting standards." He looked around for allies, but instead of nods, he met eyes that did not drop. The audience he thought he owned had shifted to witness, and there is nothing more threatening to counterfeit power than a crowd that has learned how to watch. Michael's reply seemed almost gentle. "Discipline without empathy collapses under its own weight," he said. "It becomes punishment dressed as order, and hard choices that harm the small aren't strength. They're shortcuts." He turned his body so that Ethan was in his periphery, a subtle gesture that kept the child within his protection, without turning him into a prop. Excellence is a long journey. It asks for craft. It asks for character. A busser, barely 20, edged forward with a tray he no longer knew what to do with. "Chef," he whispered, "table 12 needs. Do you want—" He stopped, worried he'd broken the spell. Michael glanced at him, eyes warm for a heartbeat. "You're doing fine," he said, and the young man straightened, a small transformation visible in the set of his shoulders. Even minor characters carry the story when someone shows them how. Richard's impatience flared. "Enough. Either remove the boy, or I take my business elsewhere, and I advise everyone I know to do the same." He looked to the manager, who stood by the host stand, torn between hospitality protocols and the morality unfolding at table level. Pressure can make people choose prematurely. Conviction helps them choose well. The manager took one slow breath and didn't move. "Let me be clear," Michael said, and this time the room heard a line being drawn. "No one is removing him for crying." He let the sentence land with the simplicity of a recipe that works every time. "What we remove from this room is the assumption that power equals permission." He finally addressed Richard by name, plain and unadorned. "Mr. Hale, you do not get to define who belongs." The use of the surname startled him. Recognition without reverence. "You know who I am," Richard said, trying to make the knowledge tilt the floor back in his favor. "I do," Michael answered, neutral as a ledger. "And I know who I am." He tapped his chest lightly. "I'm responsible for this house." He gestured to the staff, the guests, the kitchen humming behind the door. "And a house is more than its chandeliers." Ethan's breathing had steadied. He watched the exchange with the wide, attentive eyes of someone learning in real time what adults are capable of, both the harm and the help. Can I stay?" he asked, and his question was not timid but honest, as if he were testing the architecture of belonging. Michael nodded again. "Yes." A beat. "You're not alone." The phrase held more than comfort. It hinted at the geometry of the room's relationships, at a behind-the-scenes web the diners couldn't yet see. A murmur rippled through the restaurant. Not the sound of gossip, but the sound of people returning to themselves. Suspense had done its work. The question forming on every face had turned from "will anyone defend the child?" to "what happens when someone finally does?" This was the hinge, the turning point where a single choice began to redraw the night. Richard straightened, gathering his coat as if to rise, then thought better of it and settled again, unwilling to concede an inch of territory. "You'll regret this," he said, but the threat sounded smaller than it had 10 minutes ago, as if the room had reduced its size by refusing to echo it back. Power feels expansive until character enters, then it scrambles for a chair. Michael didn't flinch. "Regret comes from violating your own standards," he said, "not from upholding them." He looked to the kitchen once more, and something unspoken passed through the doorway. A readiness, a willingness, the kind of coordination only teams forged in heat can manage. His eyes returned to Ethan, softening for a fraction of a second. "Would you like some water with lemon?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, please." It was a small transaction and an enormous one. A child asking, an adult responding, the architecture of care restored one glass at a time. The waiter, who had been frozen earlier, moved, placing the water gently on the table, the lemon bright as a punctuation mark. Ethan whispered, "Thank you." The two words hovered like a delicate bridge, built quickly, strong enough to carry meaning across a space where cruelty had tried to set up residence. Richard watched, baffled that the scene did not bend to his will. He drummed his fingers on the table, seeking momentum in the rhythm. "This is sentimental nonsense," he declared. "Restaurants are businesses, not sanctuaries." Michael's reply was soft, and for that reason it carried. "Businesses are built by people," he said. "What you protect tells the truth about what you are." The guests felt it, the shift from spectacle to standard, from dominance to decisions. Suspense does not end when a hero steps forward. It deepens, because now the story has direction. With every second, the question tilted, not whether the chef would intervene, but why his intervention felt inevitable, as if the night had been steering toward this the entire time. Curiosity stretched toward the unanswered. What connection tied the chef to the boy? Why had the air in the kitchen held its breath before the doors opened? What revelation waited just beyond the threshold of language? Michael took a slow breath. "The kind you draw before crossing a line you can't uncross." "Mr. Hale," he said, voice level, "you asked why I involved myself." He looked at Ethan, then at the guests, then back to Richard. "There's a reason I stepped out from the back." The room leaned in with the same motion, a single organism on the verge of hearing something that would reframe everything they had seen. The answer wasn't spectacle. It was a key, ready to turn in a lock that had kept more than one door closed. And as Michael's next words gathered, the night braced for revelations that would show what had always been there, waiting to be named. Michael's voice came like a blade through velvet, steady, sharp, impossible to ignore. "Enough, Richard." He said the name without title, without embellishment, the way one does when stripping a person of the illusions they hide behind. The air in the restaurant seemed to tighten, every ear turning toward the sound that was no longer background noise but command. Authority had shifted, and everyone felt it. The chef's tone didn't beg, didn't plead, it declared. And for the first time that evening, Richard wasn't the one directing the stage. Richard set his glass down harder than he intended, the sharp clink echoing across the table. "You dare speak to me like that in front of my peers?" His voice carried, swollen with outrage, but beneath it was something more fragile, the surprise of being confronted in a space he believed he owned. He straightened his shoulders, adjusting his cufflinks as though polished fabric could restore the balance of power. "Do you know who you're talking to?" Michael didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice, but his words filled the space as though the walls themselves leaned forward to listen. "I know exactly who I'm talking to. A man who believes his money gives him the right to belittle a child, a man who thinks arrogance passes for strength, and a man who needs to be reminded tonight that this room is not his stage." His gaze never left Richard's face, steady and unblinking, the way only someone grounded in conviction can look at another. The diners, who had been shrinking into their seats minutes before, now leaned forward, eyes darting between the two men as though watching a tide collide with rock. The atmosphere pulsed with tension, suspense swirling like smoke. People weren't sure whether to fear an explosion or welcome a transformation, but they knew something irreversible was unfolding. Richard's laugh was brittle, a sound designed to convince himself more than anyone else. "This is outrageous. I built towers in this city. I've shaken hands with governors and mayors. You're a chef in an apron. You make plates look pretty." His words tried to cut, but they landed dull against the armor of someone who understood value in ways money could never measure. Michael took one step closer, not in aggression but in presence, bridging the space with calm weight. "You're right," he said, evenly. "I am a chef. I spend nights in heat and noise, sleeves rolled, hands scarred, making sure strangers leave satisfied. But don't mistake what you see as service for weakness. This apron has seen more courage than your suits ever will. Because while you build towers of glass, I build tables where people come to remember they are human." The impact of the words rolled through the room like a hidden truth surfacing. Guests exchanged glances, some with raised brows, others with lips pressed tight to keep from betraying the awe rising inside them. For the first time, Richard looked unsettled, his usual performance faltering under the weight of someone who refused to play his game. Ethan watched, wide-eyed, his small hands still trembling, but for the first time his tears paused. He whispered just loud enough for Michael to hear, "You're not afraid of him." Michael glanced briefly at the boy, his expression softening. "Why should I be afraid of a man who hides behind noise?" He answered quietly, before turning his gaze back to Richard. Richard slammed his palm on the table, rattling silverware. "You don't know the risks of crossing me. I could ruin you with a single phone call. I could end your career before sunrise." The threat carried weight in his circles, but here, in this moment, it sounded like desperation. The performance of power rang hollow against the authenticity of conviction. Michael didn't move. "Maybe you could," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "Maybe you could try, but understand this. Ruin doesn't come from losing a job. Ruin comes from losing your soul. And that happens every time you choose cruelty over compassion." His words weren't just directed at Richard anymore. They expanded, spreading across the tables, planting seeds in every mind present. The diners felt it. They felt the shift in gravity, the way the authority in the room had been wrestled away from the man with money and claimed by the man with integrity. They weren't passive anymore. Their silence was no longer compliance, but anticipation. They were waiting, not for Richard's response, but for the revelations that seemed inevitable now, waiting in the wings like actors ready for their cue. Richard's face reddened, his jaw tight. "You think you can humiliate me in front of all these people?" he demanded. But the irony was stark. He had humiliated himself long before Michael spoke. His arrogance, his loud derision of a child, had already cracked the mask he wore. Michael had simply turned the light toward the fracture. The boy's whisper returned, stronger this time, fragile but steady. "I'm not weak." Ethan's words traveled farther than they should have, carried by the silence that welcomed them. A hush fell again, not of fear, but of respect. The diners who had once turned away now turned toward the boy, as though his small voice held more courage than Richard's entire fortune. Michael nodded, acknowledging Ethan's statement like a verdict. "No, you're not weak," he affirmed. Then, his eyes cutting back to Richard, he added, "But mocking him was." The weight of that sentence landed hard, heavier than raised voices or slammed fists could have. It was the kind of line that reshapes a room, the kind that lingers in memory long after the night has ended. For the first time, Richard had no immediate reply. He sat back, his hand frozen on the stem of his glass, his mouth opening then closing without sound. What happens in moments like this isn't just confrontation, it's revelation. It's the hidden truth of who people are when their masks are stripped away. Richard was a man, defined by noise, by the appearance of control, by the illusion of superiority. Michael, on the other hand, revealed himself as someone defined by decisions made in the heat of discomfort, by a mindset rooted in principle rather than applause. The guests had come for a meal, but what they were witnessing was a transformation. The stage they thought belonged to. Wealth now belonged to dignity. The child who had been invisible minutes before now carried the moral weight of the room, and the chef who had once been behind the scenes now stood in the center, not because he sought attention, but because truth has a way of pulling itself forward, no matter how hard arrogance tries to suppress it. Richard tried one last defense, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "You don't understand. I have a reputation to protect." But Michael's reply dismantled it. With surgical precision. "Reputation without integrity is nothing more than performance," he said, "and tonight everyone here saw the difference." The restaurant's silence broke, not with applause, not yet, but with the unspoken acknowledgement that a shift had occurred. The diners no longer feared Richard's influence. They were leaning, watching, waiting for what Michael would reveal next. The balance of power was gone, redistributed into something far more stable, respect for truth. And just as Richard tried to gather himself, the faintest murmur came from the kitchen doors, a movement beyond sight, as if the night itself was preparing to expose the deeper story still hidden. Michael's face remained steady, but in his eyes there was something unspoken, something waiting. The kind of revelation that doesn't just change a room, it changes the journey of everyone inside it. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room seemed to hang on a hinge, suspended between the world it had been 10 minutes ago and the world it was becoming. Michael's hands rested lightly at his sides, steady, measured, as if he were back on the line calling the timing for entrees, except this time the order he was giving was to the night itself. When he finally inhaled, it wasn't dramatic. It was intentional, the breath of someone about to make a decision he can't take back. His eyes settled on Ethan first, then lifted to meet Richard's, and then traveled across the tables so every person in that space felt seen, implicated, invited. "You wanted a reason," he said, voice even. "Here it is." He didn't gesture grandly. He simply stepped to Ethan's chair and placed a hand on the back of it with a gentleness that rewrote the atmosphere. "He's my son." The sentence wasn't loud, but it rang through crystal and cloth and polished wood like a bell clear enough to center a crowd. A stir passed over the room, an intake of breath here, a sudden stillness there, each reaction knitting itself into the collective. Understanding of what they were watching, the hidden truth had been walking among them the whole time, small and trembling, while they looked for explanations everywhere else. Richard's face hardened, then flickered, surprise, irritation, calculation, all in the space of a heartbeat. "Your son." He leaned forward as if trying to push the words back into Michael's mouth. "What, you brought a child into a dining room you're supposed to manage?" "I brought him into a house I'm responsible for," Michael said, and then he turned to Ethan, lowering his voice without losing any strength. "Tell them what you heard." Ethan swallowed. The tears that had dried on his cheeks shone under the chandelier's warm light. "I didn't mean to listen," he whispered. "I was just by the hallway. And some people, they were laughing." His eyes drifted toward a table that suddenly found interest in their napkins. "They said the chef was always sweating back there like a mule, so rich people could post pictures of pretty food. They said you were just—" He stopped, breath hitching. "A kitchen guy." The phrase landed with a thud that had nothing to do with volume. It was the kind of insult designed to shrink a life of skill into a caricature, to turn craft into servitude in one lazy curl of a lip. Michael didn't flinch, but his hand on the chair tightened almost imperceptibly. "Go on," he said gently. Ethan blinked. "And then you—" He looked at Richard, the courage it took to do so visible in the tremor of his chin. "You said I didn't belong. You said I was weak. I know you didn't know who I was, but you knew I was a kid." The room absorbed it. The truth knitting itself to the timeline, the behind-the-scenes fatigue of a father who had worked a double shift to cover for a sick-line cook. The hallway where a boy waited with a book because he loved being near the clang and steam of where his dad made magic out of ingredients. The careless mouths that filled time with easy contempt. The final blow, delivered with a millionaire's smirk that took a child's quiet sadness and cracked it open into sobs. It wasn't drama for its own sake. It was a map of impact. "I didn't know," Richard said, an instinctive defense that sounded small in the acoustics of revelation. "You're right," Michael replied, not unkindly. "You didn't. That's the point. You built your decision on the scaffolding of assumption. That's a fragile mindset dressed up as authority." The word mindset hung there, deliberately, not as jargon, but as a measure of the choices that had shaped the night. You saw tears and called them weakness. He saw laughter at his dad and didn't know where to put it. So it came out the only way a 9-year-old body knows how. It came out as grief. Ethan's fingers closed around the edge of the table, not in defiance, but in anchoring. "I heard them say you were nothing," he murmured to Michael. "And I thought, what if they're right?" The confession was quiet enough to slice. The room open. "Hey!" Michael said, dropping to one knee so they were eye level, the white of his chef coat catching the light. "People say a lot of things when they've never learned to see, but you know what's true." Ethan hesitated, then exhaled. "You work hard," Michael nodded. "And hard work isn't the whole story. Why do I work the way I do?" Ethan's answer was immediate, like a reflex trained by years of being loved. "Because you care about people." The diners shifted as if adjusting to a new gravity. The story they had been telling themselves, that the chef's appearance was a breach of decorum, gave way to a clearer narrative. A father correcting an imbalance with the only tools he had ever trusted: steadiness, craft, and an unwillingness to abandon the vulnerable. The journey of the room slid from spectacle toward conscience. Richard attempted to reassert his old architecture. "So you brought him out here to what, embarrass me?" Michael stood, the motion precise, intentional. "No," he said. "I brought him into the open because shame grows in the dark. We do better in truth. And you can't fix what you refuse to name." He let the line settle, then added with a calm that made the words feel heavier. "You weren't the only voice tonight. You just happened to be the loudest." His gaze moved to the table, where the earlier ridicule had sparked the first crack. One of the men there stared at his plate as if he might find absolution between the parsley and the char. A woman, near the window, touched her chest, her expression a complicated mixture of guilt and relief, like a person remembering a time she'd chosen silence and deciding not to choose it again. She whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "We eat what others endure." The thought moved through the space like a current, the awareness of behind-the-scenes labor that made their leisure possible, of calloused hands hidden by linen walls, of names forgotten because the plates had been beautiful. "I'm not here to condemn every person in this room," Michael continued, and the gentleness landed like a mercy. "We're all travelers in our own blind spots." But a boy cried because the distance between front-of-house applause and back-of-house exhaustion became a canyon he had to cross alone. You laughed at the echo. He didn't point, didn't accuse by name. He just told the truth, as if it were a recipe everyone could follow if they wanted to. "Tonight, we close the distance." Richard shook his head. Slowly, a practiced smile returning like a mask reattached. "You're turning feelings into policy," he said. "That's not how decisions get made in the real world." Michael's reply was light, almost conversational. "I make decisions every minute that have real-world consequences. Overcook the halibut, and I waste a fisherman's dawn. Cut corners on sanitation, and I gamble with a stranger's health. Send a line cook back into service when he's shaking with exhaustion, and I teach the team that people are disposable. These aren't feelings, they're standards." He tipped his head slightly, as though acknowledging a familiar enemy. "You're right about one thing. Standards do determine outcomes, which is why the standard we enforce tonight matters." Ethan's voice threaded in again, tentative but braver. "Dad, can I say something?" Michael turned. "You just did," he said softly, a faint smile touching his mouth. Then he stepped aside. Ethan looked at Richard, his chin lifting a fraction. "I wasn't trying to ruin your dinner," he said. "I heard them talking about my dad like he was less than. It made something hurt." He paused, searching for words roomy enough to hold a child's complicated hurt. "When you said I didn't belong, it felt like you were saying he didn't belong either." The boy's honesty struck harder than any adult's lecture could have. It revealed the architecture of impact. Contempt traveling from adults to a child who had no armor but truth. A father in a kitchen, separated by a set of doors. A son in the dining room, separated by a set of expectations. The journey between those spaces, work and display, labor and leisure, had seemed decorative until a 9-year-old mapped it with tears. Richard let out a breath that sounded like a concession disguised as irritation. "I said what I said," he muttered. "You're asking me to feel sorry for a crying kid in a fine dining room. That's not my problem." Michael didn't stiffen. He softened, which somehow felt stronger. "None of us asked for your pity," he said. "We asked for your restraint." He gestured gently to the staff, to the guests, to the space itself. There are nights when the most generous thing a powerful person can do is subtract his voice. A busser set down a breadbasket with hands that had stopped shaking. The manager, who had been rooted to the host stand, took 2 steps forward, not in confrontation, but in alignment. Across the floor, people's posture changed. Small calibrations that signaled a new center of gravity. The room had been a stage for wealth. Now it felt like a classroom where the lesson had finally matched the moment. Michael turned the lens back to cause, not just effect. He wasn't crying because he wanted attention, he said, looking around the room so the message couldn't be quarantined to one table. He was crying because the people who mock a worker's dignity will always, eventually, mock a child's place. That's the slope. That's the sequence. He glanced at Ethan. "You heard the first part. You caught the second." Ethan nodded slowly, a kid recognizing the pattern he'd stumbled into, the sort of behind-the-scenes logic grown-ups pretend isn't there. Someone near the bar spoke up, tentative but present. "Chef, we didn't know." Michael exhaled. "I'm not here to punish the not knowing," he said. "Ignorance is a starting point, not a sentence. What matters is what we do with the revelation." The word revelations didn't flash like fireworks. It opened like a door. The crowd stepped closer to it without moving their feet, drawn by the momentum of a narrative that had shifted from spectacle to meaning. The mindset in the room was changing because the facts had been reframed. Not a crying boy disrupting luxury, but a family caught in the cross-current of contempt and expectation, carrying grace through heat and noise until someone decided that loudness should set the rules. Ethan slid off his chair and stood beside Michael, the top of his head barely reaching his father's ribs. "I'm okay now," he said, not because the hurt had vanished, but because being seen had steadied him. The line cooks watching from the crack of the kitchen doors eased back, their faces a mixture of pride and relief, like a team that had watched its captain skate the length of the ice to defend the smallest player. Richard looked around, searching for purchase on a hill that no longer existed. The room had rebalanced without his permission. He tapped the base of his glass again, the gesture a nervous metronome. "So, what now?" he asked, and the question, stripped of bravado, sounded almost human. "What happens next? Do you want me to apologize to a child?" He said child, like it was an obstacle rather than a person. "That's between you and your conscience," Michael answered. "I can't script your transformation." He let the word stand, not as a taunt, but as an invitation. "But I can tell you what happens here. We serve dinner. We protect dignity. We choose standards that won't sell out the smallest person in the room." He turned his hand palm up in a gesture that was strangely hospitable. "You're welcome to stay, on those terms." The terms weren't a punishment. They were a boundary, a line drawn so clearly even the quietest person in the room could lean against it and feel safe. It was a decision, and decisions, more than declarations, create culture. The guests could feel it, the impact of a rule made in real time by the person willing to bear its cost. Ethan tugged at his dad's sleeve. "Can I go back to the kitchen?" The request wasn't an escape. It was a homing signal. "For a minute," Michael said, "and then you eat with me." He looked up, addressing the room without breaking the intimacy of the exchange. "We made a family meal tonight. that I think just found its purpose." The cooks at the door straightened like a chord struck in tune. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. He seemed to realize that the next thing he said would define him more than any magazine cover had. He looked at Ethan, and for a fraction of a second, something unguarded passed over his face, the trace memory of a time before his arrogance had hardened into habit. "Kid," he said, and the word came out less sharp than he intended. "I didn't." The apology hovered, unconstructed, not yet ready to walk. He shut it away with a tight swallow. "Do what you want," he muttered instead, but the room had already registered the crack. Michael touched the chair. Back once more, a silent punctuation. "We'll be right back," he told Ethan, yet the sentence carried to the tables like a reassurance that the story had not broken. It had turned. He turned to the staff, one nod to the expo, another to the manager, and the choreography resumed, altered but intact, a brigade rediscovering its cadence after a storm. No one clapped. It would have felt wrong, too tidy for a night that had just revealed how messy the lines between power and decency can be. But something more honest happened. People straightened their silverware, not as a nervous tick, but as if to signal readiness for a different kind of meal. Conversations restarted in low tones that had less to do with menu notes and more to do with conscience. The room's center had moved, and with it the measure of belonging. Ethan took his father's hand. "I didn't break anything, right?" he asked quietly. "You broke a spell," Michael said, and even Richard looked away then, as if the sentence had landed on him too. The boy nodded, accepting the answer with the solemnity only children can offer when they believe a grown-up has told them the whole truth. They turned toward the kitchen doors, toward heat, toward noise, toward the place where effort becomes nourishment. The path between front and back had been redrawn, not as a wall, but as a bridge. And in the hush that followed, with plates warming and hearts recalibrating, every person in that room could feel the next movement assembling itself, ready to test whether the revelation they'd witnessed would echo in action or fade into the wallpaper of a night no one wanted to remember the old way. Richard had always lived in a world where money bought not only silence, but validation. In the offices he ruled, subordinates nodded even before he finished speaking. At the galas he sponsored, every laugh landed on cue, every toast rehearsed by those eager to stay close to his orbit. But the restaurant tonight was no longer bending to him. It had shifted, recalibrated itself around a truth that money couldn't bend. And in that recalibration, Richard found himself standing on the outside of his own performance. He felt it first in the stillness, not the submissive silence he once mistook for respect, but the kind of stillness that exposes, that leaves a man's words echoing back at him with no one to absorb the blow. The arrogance that had carried his sentences earlier now clung to him like smoke, a reminder of fire he himself had started. Richard reached for his glass again, but the motion betrayed him. His hand trembled just enough that the stem wobbled against his fingers. He quickly steadied it, lifting the rim to his lips in a gesture rehearsed thousands of times. But the wine tasted metallic now, sour against his tongue. He set it down harder than he meant to, the sound jarring in the calm. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't racing ahead with strategies, but circling back on itself like a mirror maze. His mocking words replayed in his head, weak, out of place, and he realized with a sting that the reflection of cruelty wasn't on the child. It was on him. Every syllable he'd thrown with confidence had boomeranged back, stripping away the armor he built from wealth. Across the table, Ethan sat straighter, not because he was suddenly braver, but because truth had steadied him. Richard's chest tightened at the sight. The boy's tears no longer looked like weakness. They looked like courage he himself had never learned to hold. For the first time, Richard wondered if he had humiliated not just a child, but himself, revealing how small he truly looked beneath the chandeliers he thought he owned. The diners felt it too. Their eyes no longer darted nervously away when Richard looked up. They met his gaze with steady, unflinching quiet. That quiet was worse than ridicule. Ridicule he could have countered with bravado, but this silence carried judgment wrapped in clarity. It was the weight of collective recognition that his performance had collapsed. "Do you people not see what's happening here?" Richard demanded suddenly, his voice higher than he intended, the edge of panic bleeding through. "You're all acting like I'm the villain for expecting standards." The room did not answer. Standards had been redefined without his permission. He knew it, and so did everyone else. Michael remained still, not attacking, not gloating. His restraint made the collapse sharper because Richard had no enemy to rail against. The enemy was himself. Every gesture, every phrase, every display of superiority now looked desperate. Even he could feel it. He tried again, quieter this time, the sound of a man searching for escape. "You don't understand what it's like to be me. The pressure, the eyes always on you. You slip once, and people never forget." But the irony hung too heavy to ignore. He hadn't slipped. He had shoved, mocked, humiliated, and now the forgetting he feared would never arrive. Richard's shoulders slumped slightly. His spine, once straight with the posture of entitlement, curved under the weight of shame pressing down. His eyes darted toward the exit for the briefest second, the instinct to flee clashing with the pride that chained him to his chair. His reputation, the thing he clung to most tightly, was unraveling in front of strangers, and for the first time in a long time, he couldn't buy his way back. He glanced at Ethan again. The boy's face wasn't accusing, just raw with honesty. That unguarded expression pierced deeper than any adult's judgment. It reminded Richard of a time decades ago when his own son, long grown now, had looked at him with a similar hurt, when he had chosen business over baseball games, power over presence. That memory struck him like an old injury, suddenly flaring in the bone. He shifted in his seat, blinking fast, fighting the sting behind his eyes. The crowd didn't see a titan of industry anymore. They saw a man exposed by his own choices, a man whose foundation wasn't concrete but sand. His empire didn't matter in this room. What mattered was the father standing beside his son, the truth revealed by a child's tears, the justice of dignity outweighing arrogance. Richard opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words tangled. He began, then faltered, staring at his hands as though the answers might be etched there. "I didn't." He stopped again. The excuses that had always come easily sounded brittle in his throat. There was no script for this collapse. Michael didn't press. He didn't need to. The justice was already complete. Richard had been stripped of the illusion that power without compassion could hold a room. That was the downfall, not in shouts or fists, but in the quiet unraveling of a man forced to see himself as others finally did. The diners resumed breathing in unison, as though they had all been waiting for the crack to fully show. Forks were adjusted, napkins smoothed, not as distractions, but as small rituals grounding them in the shift they had just witnessed. They weren't looking to Richard anymore. They were looking past him, toward the father and son who had rewritten the night's meaning. Richard's gaze followed theirs, and what he saw hollowed him out further. The authority in the room had moved permanently. No amount of towers he had built outside could rebuild the one crumbling inside these walls. His kingdom of applause had collapsed under the simplest truth. Money doesn't make you strong. How you treat the vulnerable does. The realization washed over him with a burn that settled into his chest. Shame wasn't abstract anymore. It was personal, alive, unrelenting. He knew this night would follow him. He knew the story would be retold, not in newspapers or boardrooms, but in the memories of everyone who had been there. And those stories, whispered and shared, would weigh heavier than headlines. His fork slipped from his grip, clattering softly against the porcelain plate, the sound strangely final. He didn't pick it up. His appetite was gone, replaced by the awareness that he had consumed his own image until there was nothing left to feed on. The boy shifted, leaning closer to Michael, his small frame steady now, no longer curled into himself. "Dad," Ethan said softly, Can we go home soon? It was a simple question, but it carried the entire arc of the evening. The recognition that safety wasn't in chandeliers or applause, but in presence, in being seen and defended. Michael nodded once, the subtle gesture enough to assure his son that the night's pain had been transformed into something stronger. The father's quiet steadiness stood in stark contrast to Richard's unraveling performance, and the juxtaposition told the whole story without another word. Richard lowered his head, staring at the tablecloth, his reflection warped in the silver utensils beside him. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like the wealthiest man in the room. He felt like the poorest, and in that fragile pause, as the weight of the night pressed harder, the story wasn't over. It was merely pivoting, preparing to reveal what justice looks like when truth has already torn down the walls of arrogance. The restaurant breathed again, but it wasn't the same breath it had taken at the beginning of the night. It was slower now, fuller, like a chest finally expanding after being held too tight for too long. The hum of the room didn't return to its old rhythm. It found a new one, anchored not in spectacle but in something sturdier, respect, presence, the quiet gravity of a truth that had been named out loud. Michael stood with one hand still on the back of Ethan's chair, as if the simple touch could keep the room grounded. Richard sat opposite them, the gleam of his cufflinks suddenly irrelevant under the chandelier's patient light. No one rushed to fill the silence. That was the first sign the night had shifted. People were willing to sit inside the consequence of what they had just witnessed. Michael didn't move to claim center stage, yet the room made space for him. Authority is not a crown, it's a responsibility, and you could see it in the way he held himself. Steady, shoulders squared without stiffness, a man who knew the weight of timing and temperature in a kitchen, and was now applying that same craft to a room full of strangers. When he spoke, it wasn't to perform. It was to set a standard in a voice that had measured 1,000 sautés and quieted 100 fires. Money doesn't measure a man, Richard. The way you treat those who serve you does. The sentence didn't crash. It landed. It didn't need ornament, didn't ask for an echo. It just took its place, clean, exact, like a chef's knife laid flat on a cutting board. The words moved through crystal, across linen, past the double doors where the line cooks watched from the seam like a chorus holding its note. In that single line, the night's hidden truth surfaced fully. Value isn't tallied in dollars or followers or reserved tables. It is revealed in decisions at eye level, in small moments where kindness could go either way and a person chooses which story to write. Someone exhaled with a sound almost like relief. The manager by the host stand lowered his shoulders half an inch, the tension leaving his posture as if it had been told it could go home. A couple near the window looked at each other with a recognition that required no words. The applause started. Lightly, one pair of hands, then another, and then it gathered. Not the thunder of a performance, but the warm, rising gratitude of people acknowledging a standard they wanted to adopt. It wasn't loud. It was real. Employees joined first, a few hesitant claps from the servers who had been trained to disappear, then stronger, more certain, as the guests followed. The sound filled the room with something like permission. Richard didn't stand. For the first time, he didn't reach for the moment to bend. It backed toward himself. He didn't argue or command or smirk. He lowered his head, not theatrically, but because the weight of what had been said found the right place to rest. His hands still framed his untouched plate, but the posture around them collapsed inward, an architecture of pride, finally bowing under the pressure of truth. He was not weeping. He wasn't even speaking. Yet the silence around him felt like a confession more complete than words could manage. Ethan watched, his body angled, instinctively toward Michael. The boy's face had changed, not erased of hurt, but set by a new understanding. You don't have to be the loudest to change the room. You have to be the clearest. He tugged gently at Michael's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, "they're clapping for you." Michael shook his head once, a small smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. "No," he said softly, low enough that only Ethan could hear. They're clapping for the standard. That distinction turned the applause into something deeper. People weren't just celebrating a confrontation well delivered, they were stepping toward a mindset they could carry out the door. Because transformation in public spaces rarely arrives with trumpets. It arrives as a series of private decisions made in quick succession. A guest meeting a server's eyes with respect, a manager protecting a busser from a customer's temper, a powerful man choosing to measure himself by a different metric than the one he'd used for years. Small hinges, big doors. Richard lifted his gaze an inch, then let it fall again. A man trying to locate the person he was before the scaffolding of his habits built a tower too tall to climb down from. He wasn't ready for sentences. He barely had fragments. "I never," he started, then stopped because the old explanations didn't clear the air. They muddied it. The room didn't strain for an apology. It held a patient kind of stillness, the kind that invites a different set of decisions without demanding performance. Michael didn't press him. The line he had delivered was not a trap, it was a compass. He turned his attention outward, not to capitalize on the applause, but to give it a direction. "Restaurants," he said, speaking as if to the walls and the people and the stories that would be told later, "are bridges. Behind the scenes is where the crossing begins. If we forget that, we forget each other." He paused, just long enough to let the image seat itself, then continued in the same even tone. "We serve food, yes, but the work is dignity, plate by plate, choice by choice." At the kitchen seam, a line cook wiped a forearm across his brow, leaving a clean streak through the sheen of heat. "He's doing service out there," he muttered, half to himself, half to the guard manger beside him. "Different station, same mission." The younger cook nodded, eyes bright. "Feels like the whole house is on the pass." Ethan's voice threaded in, shy but sure. "Can we stay for family?" "Meal then?" Michael glanced down with that same steady fondness, the kind that doesn't look away when things are hard. "Yeah," he said, "we can." He looked back to the room, then toward the kitchen. "We all can." The simple invitation did more than save a night. It reframed it. The impact wasn't in a sweeping speech, but in a reorientation, from a spectacle that fed ego to a table that fed people. Richard's fingers finally unclenched from the edge of his plate. He looked at Michael, not with the confrontation that had defined him, but with the tentative, searching expression of someone standing at the lip of a new path and unsure how to take the first step. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, unpracticed at this register. "You said, the way I treat those who serve me." He paused, choosing each word as if it might cut if mishandled. "I haven't measured well." It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was an admission, a foundational stone laid in ground that had been unstable for years. Michael answered without triumph, his tone closer to a coach's than a judge's. "Measurement can change," he said, "but only if the standard does." The sentence was offered like a hand, not a verdict, a choice extended rather than a sentence imposed. Around them, the staff began to move again, the dance of service resuming with new choreography. Water glasses were topped off, plates were checked. A server slipped a small dish of olives onto Ethan's table, the way you give a compass to a traveler. "You want to see arrive." Conversations restarted, quieter, more intentional. The restaurant didn't return to normal. It advanced toward something better. A guest in a navy blazer cleared his throat, the courage arriving in pieces. "Chef," he said, "thank you." It wasn't dramatic. It was sincere in a way that made it almost holy. "I didn't realize how much I lean on people I never see." His partner squeezed his hand under the table, a decision made in tandem, to carry this recognition out into their own lives where there were other rooms, other thresholds, other chances to choose. Ethan reached for an olive, then thought of something and let his hand hover. "Can I bring some to the kitchen?" he asked. A grin flickered across Michael's face, gone as quickly as it came, replaced by his dependable calm. "Good call," he said. "Ask Rosa if she'll set out bowls. You know where they go." Ethan nodded, and took the small dish in both hands, with the care of a boy entrusted with something worth protecting. "I'll do it right," he promised. The declaration was small and seismic, a child practicing the muscle of responsibility in a room that had just redefined it. Richard watched this exchange with a concentration that looked almost like study. Seeing a standard lived out is more disarming than hearing it described. He rubbed his thumb along the seam of his napkin, the white linen suddenly less a prop than a place to rest his uncertainty. When he looked up again, his voice steadied, if only slightly. "How do you start changing a number you've used all your life?" he asked. The question wasn't rhetorical, it was raw. Michael answered without flourish. "One decision at a time." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Simplicity is a form of mercy to a man who has overcomplicated his worth. The applause had quieted into the kind of murmur that belongs to rooms where something good has just happened, and people are deciding how not to waste it. The staff shifted naturally into service again, but their movements carried a new intention, a visible agreement that the standard named out loud would not be left on the floor like a dropped utensil. Even the building seemed to settle into its joints differently, as if the beams themselves had exhaled. Ethan returned from the kitchen without the olives, his hands free, his face brighter. "Rosa said to tell you she's got it," he reported, proud to be the messenger. "And Luis is making extra pasta because transformations need carbohydrates." Michael huffed a small laugh, quick, grateful, honest. "Smart man," he said. "We'll send a plate to table 6. Richard traced the lip of his glass, then let his hand fall away. "I've been measuring the wrong things," he said, a confession in present tense, not just past. "I thought outcomes were the only proof." He swallowed. "I didn't see the people in the process." The last word arrived awkwardly, as if he'd pulled a new tool from a drawer and wasn't sure how it fit in. His hand. The room didn't reward him, it simply allowed him to keep going. Michael gave a small nod that felt like permission. "Outcomes matter," he said, "but process is where character lives." He looked briefly at Ethan, just enough to remind the room what process had meant tonight. You don't get different outcomes without different habits. The word habits floated out into the dining room like a blueprint, practical and challenging. Habits, the daily decisions, the unseen repetitions, the quiet rewrites of instinct. Richard's jaw tightened and loosened, as if testing the fit of the idea against the shape of his life. A pair of guests rose from their table, approached the host stand, and spoke softly to the manager. A minute later, the manager nodded and turned to Michael. "Chef," he said, "table 12 asked if they could cover a family meal tonight." Michael almost smiled. "Tell them we accept," he said, "but we share the credit." He turned to the guests and added, "You can help. Serve, if you like." They blinked at the invitation, then nodded eagerly, a little nervous, a lot willing. That's how standards spread, through participation, not applause. Richard sat with his hands open on the linen, neither surrendering nor warring, just open. He looked at Michael with a steadier gaze. "I can't erase what I said." The humility of the sentence surprised even himself. "No," Michael said, "but you can stop re-saying it with your choices." He let the idea take root. "If you want to measure from here, start with the people you can make visible." He tipped his head toward the staff gliding through the room with the confidence of those finally seen. "There's your metric." The chandelier's light softened as the evening rounded its corner into warmth. Dishes came out hot and fragrant, glasses refilled. The husband at table 4 made a quiet point of thanking the busser by name. At the kitchen door, Ethan stood for a moment watching the choreography he loved. The quick passes, the shouted behind, the steam lifting like ribbon from a pan, and then he drifted back to Michael's side with the contentment of a child who knows where he belongs. No one spoke of redemption, not out loud, not yet, but the architecture for it had been built, a compass line drawn, a standard named, a man left with the dignity of choosing. Richard's head bowed once more, not in defeat, but in the early, uncertain posture of someone learning how to stand differently. The night didn't wrap itself, in a bow. It opened, the way good stories open when the lesson has been spoken, and the next movement asks to be lived rather than announced. Plates for family meal began to gather on a side table. Simple food done right, the kind that tastes like steadiness. Pasta gloss just enough, greens with lemon that woke the mouth, bread that gave when you tore it. The dining room's murmur braided with the hiss of pans and the clatter of ladles. Bridges don't make noise, but you can hear the footsteps crossing them. Michael touched the back of Ethan's chair one more time, the smallest of rituals, then looked toward the pass where the next round of orders waited. The room understood the cue without needing it explained. Service would continue, but not as it had started. Standards had been set where everyone could reach them, and in the quiet spaces between courses, between apology and action, between habit and change, the night arranged itself for the movement to come, leaving just enough light. Along the path, for the next decision to find its mark. The restaurant carried on, but it was no longer the same place people had entered earlier that evening. The chandeliers still glowed, the silverware still caught the light, and the servers still wove between tables with practiced grace. Yet the energy in the air had been altered. What had begun as a stage for arrogance was now a quiet sanctuary for truth. People leaned toward each other with softer voices, not to gossip, but to share a thought, a realization, perhaps even a confession. The echo of Michael's words lingered, not as an aftertaste, but as nourishment. Money doesn't measure a man. The way you treat those who serve you does. Richard sat in his chair, shoulders slumped as though gravity itself had grown heavier. He wasn't being humiliated by anyone else. No one mocked him, no one pointed fingers. The collapse had come from within, as shame always does when truth finally pierces the armor of pride. He kept his gaze on the table, but in the reflection of the polished silver he saw more than his cufflinks. He saw the emptiness of a life measured only in applause and possessions. For the first time, he wondered what it would mean to measure by dignity instead. Michael, meanwhile, moved with the steady rhythm of someone returning to the task that defined him. He didn't stand at Richard's table to bask in victory. He returned to the flow of the restaurant, to his people, to the work. That was the deeper lesson. True authority doesn't linger in confrontation. It carries on with integrity. His presence radiated through the staff, each server straighter, each busser calmer, each cook in the back moving with renewed confidence. A house is only as strong as the standard it lives by, and tonight that standard had been rebuilt in real time. Ethan, who had been silent for long stretches, finally spoke again, his small voice threading through the calm like a reminder of why any of it mattered. "Dad," he whispered, tugging at Michael's sleeve. "Are we safe now?" Michael crouched beside him, eye level once more. "Yes," he said simply, "you are safe." The boy's breath steadied, his posture relaxed, and that small exchange carried more weight than any speech could have. Safety is what the vulnerable ask for. Protection is what the strong must provide. The guests who had watched silently earlier felt the shift in themselves. They recognized the hidden truth they had been forced to confront. Their silence had nearly sided with cruelty. It was not Richard alone who had created the wound. It was the passivity of a room full of eyes that looked away. And yet, by the end of the night, that silence had been broken, replaced by applause, then by reflection. They knew they would carry this evening out into their own journeys, into their own behind-the-scenes moments where someone vulnerable might need them to choose courage over convenience. Richard finally lifted his head. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't attempt to reclaim the room. His words came out low, almost fragile. "I thought strength was control," he admitted, his eyes flicking briefly toward Michael before falling back to the table. "But control doesn't protect anyone. It just isolates." The honesty in his voice startled even him. He had built a lifetime of habits around domination, and yet here, in the face of a child's tears and a father's unwavering defense, the foundation had cracked enough to let something human through. Michael didn't gloat, didn't seize the chance to humiliate. He simply nodded once, steady as always. Strength, he said, isn't about standing taller than everyone else. It's about standing in front of someone smaller so they don't get knocked down. That was the mindset that carried through the room, a sentence that redefined strength in terms no fortune could counterfeit. The applause earlier had been an act of recognition. Now the quiet that followed was the deeper confirmation. People weren't clapping anymore, they were carrying the line in their minds, carrying the image of a boy defended, carrying the contrast between arrogance and compassion. And that was the real impact. Not the performance of justice, but the seed planted in memory, ready to influence decisions yet to be made. The lesson was plain but profound. True strength isn't found in mocking the vulnerable, because cruelty requires no courage. It is the default of the insecure. True strength is found in protection, in the decision to stand between harm and innocence, in the choice to use one's presence not as a weapon, but as a shield. Arrogance collapses the moment truth speaks louder than wealth, because truth has a permanence that money cannot purchase, and everyone in that room had just witnessed that collapse with their own eyes. A woman near the back table dabbed her napkin to her lips and whispered to her partner, "I'll never forget this night." Her partner nodded slowly, the weight of the evening evident in his furrowed brow. "Neither will I," he replied. It wasn't just a story they would repeat at dinner parties. It was a recalibration of how they saw their own part in the chain of dignity, whether they would defend or disappear when the next Ethan cried. Ethan leaned against his father, fatigue finally overtaking the tension that had kept him rigid. Michael's arm wrapped around him, and though nothing more was said, the embrace itself was the final punctuation to a night that had begun with tears and ended with the steady architecture of safety. The restaurant returned to service, but it wasn't routine anymore. It was renewed. Plates carried more than food. They carried the imprint of a lesson learned in public. Guests spoke in tones that acknowledged not just flavor, but the hands that had prepared it. Servers felt seen, not as shadows in the background, but as people who gave shape to the evening. And Richard remained at his table, head bowed, silent, no longer the center of attention, but still present enough to absorb the full weight of what had happened. The night didn't end with fireworks or proclamations. It ended with reflection, with the kind of quiet that signals something important has taken root. And as Michael returned to the pass, as Ethan finally smiled at the comfort of knowing he belonged, the room knew it too. Arrogance had collapsed, and dignity had stood taller in its place. The journey wasn't finished. It never is when transformation begins, but the direction was clear, lit by the fragile yet powerful glow of truth that no chandelier could outshine. And if you stayed with me until this point, it probably means the story spoke to you in some way. I'd love to know. Drop a comment below with the phrase, "This message was for me," so I can see who walked all the way through this journey. Your thoughts make this space alive, and I always enjoy reading what these stories awaken in you. If the emotions here resonated, a simple like is more than just a button. It's a quiet way of saying, yes, this matters. And if you feel these reflections add something valuable to your days, subscribing is the best way to keep walking with me through stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of what truly counts. And since the journey doesn't stop here, there's another video waiting for you that deepens this very theme. It's right here. Click and come along with me there, because the next story continues the conversation in a way I think you'll really connect with.